was one of the deadliest conflicts in history. Massive losses across the globe. At 1.3 million African troops, Africa's contribution was immense, whether here on the continent or in the Burma campaign. And this war cemetery is proof to that contribution. In this special edition of Talk Africa, we will look at Africa's contribution to the Second World War. I'm Beatrice Marshall, and welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa. This is the Nairobi War Cemetery. Behind me are over 2,000 burial sites of casualties from the Second World War. Now, when it comes to the history lesson, it often takes a Eurocentric view, and Africa's story is hardly ever told, as we found out.
Right, left, right, left.
Once a soldier, always a soldier. The 70 or so years may have aged them, but the memories never fade. When World War II broke out in 1939, Britain had a string of colonies, and with Germany and Japan rampant, it needed their help. On this continent, it needed men for the King's African Rifles. Many young men thought joining up would be a big step to a better life.
I wanted to be a technician, so a friend suggested we join the police force, but we realized that it was the army that had the opportunities.
Thought to be the single longest exodus of African men overseas since the slave trade, the British alone recruited more than 1 million from East, West and Southern Africa. Their allies, the French, 190,000. The Belgians and others drafted more than 50,000, and 60,000 more found themselves fighting on the wrong side for Japan's other main ally, the Italians.
In 1943, we went to Tanzania near the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro. This is where we started training for the war. We learned many things, from shooting with all kinds of gun and throwing grenades.
In the early years of the war, Japanese forces swept across much of Southeast Asia, including Burma, and from there they could threaten India, another colony vital to the British. So British and American forces went in against them, along with tens of thousands of African soldiers.
It was gruesome in Burma, very bad, because the Japanese were strong. But with courage and determination, we managed to push them back for miles. Many people died there, very many, but no one talks about it.
Many survivors feel they've also been lost to history. They have their memories, their scars, their service medals, but winning recognition will be the final mission of their war. Matthew Edwards, CCTV.
The Nairobi War Cemetery was started in 1941 by military authorities. It is now run by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Regional Manager Rod Carkett is joining me to tell us exactly what the Nairobi War Cemetery is all about. Rod, thank you very much for your time. What exactly is the Nairobi War Cemetery?
Well, as you said, the war cemetery was started pretty much at the beginning of the First World War. These graves actually came from a hospital. There were actually 2 mobile hospitals who were based here for several years. Was part of supporting the recruitment and training of troops. In the Second World War, a lot of these guys would have been heading up towards Ethiopia, because there were the Italians who had taken over Ethiopia, and so there was a general move north. And a lot of people were recruited here in Kenya to head off into the Far East, Burma and other countries.
But Rob, there are 2 sections here. Of course, who's where, who's here, who's there?
When you have sites that are related to hospitals, of course, they have plenty of time to bury people, and sometimes whoever was in charge decided they would start laying people out in some kind of order. So there are sort of sections. There are sort of more European graves towards the back there. There's more African graves this side. There's a Jewish section over on the far side of the cemetery there. Of course, at the time, a lot of people were used to having specific cemeteries for specific religions, and it was just a natural thing for people to do. With the commission, though, we make a point of treating everybody the same. You'll see that, you know, there are no bigger headstones for different ranks or for different nationalities or for anything such as that. Generally, this is the standard commission headstone which is used worldwide.
What was the contribution of African troops in the Second World War? Because I see quite a number of African names on the tombstones.
Oh yes, the vast majority, vast majority of people who are buried here are African troops who were recruited and trained locally. I mean, this was very much an area where the British forces came in to find, train, get everybody sorted out and shipped off to fight either in East Africa or the Far East. You've got to remember all the campaigns that went out through Burma. The idea was that the climate in the Far East is quite different to Europe. I mean, it's much more akin to Mombasa, really. And it was felt that troops that had come from Africa would be naturally better equipped for the kind of conditions that they were going to have to fight in.
There are different monuments here around the burial site. What are they for?
These are graves which, for one reason or another at the time, basically people lost the information as to where exactly they were. Some of them were actually, because we have been doing some research, there is a bit of an exercise going on at the moment to try and find those old cemeteries. So we are doing a bit of that to see if the graves are still there. In some instances we find they could be. We can certainly find the cemeteries, but often these cemeteries have almost completely disappeared. So, if you can't find a person and you can't produce a headstone, to make sure that people are commemorated, then we put names onto memorials. That's what we do this worldwide. This is nothing particular about Kenya. We do this worldwide.
In terms of what we're seeing here, are there actual people buried here?
Oh yes, yes, I'm asked that question quite frequently, particularly when we have groups of school children coming in and they think, oh, maybe this is just some kind of token gesture. But no, we are standing right here on Mr. Yotana, and he is buried right where we're standing.
The grounds look very well maintained. How do you maintain it, and who's maintaining the grounds?
Well, I suppose ultimately I lead the team. Obviously it's a reasonable sized team. I mean, here particularly at Nairobi War Cemetry we've got about 12, 13 gardeners. So yeah, they keep the cemetery the way it looks. I should say that the way you see the cemetery here, this is very much to our international standards and our international model of how cemeteries are maintained. If you went to Europe, you would find this kind of borders. You find different plants because the climate is obviously different. You'd find roses, for example, which don't tend to do so well here.
So 70 years after the end of the Second World War, do you feel that Africa's contribution to that war is recognized today globally?
Well, we're doing the best to tell people about Africa's contribution, because if you took at wars overall, if you took, for example, the First World War, people tend to associate the First World War with Europe because it's where a lot of the fighting took place. It's where a lot of people died. But you know, there was a First World War here. There was a First World War in East Africa, largely forgotten, I'm afraid. But I'm pleased to say, particularly down through Taita Taveta, there's a good deal of interest there in developing the history and letting people know that there's a story to tell.
Thanks, Rod, for your contribution. Well, do stay with us as we're going to take a short break here. And when we return, my expert guests will tell us more about Africa's contribution to the Second World War. This is the East African Memorial. It commemorates African soldiers who died in the Second World War and have no known graves, another sign of the lives the continent lost. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, earlier on, I sat down with representatives from the East, West and North Africa to find out about Africa's role and Africa's legacy. Well, to help unpack Africa's contribution to the Second World War, I have expert guests standing by. In Nairobi, Mr. Joseph Inima, he is a retired war veteran. He was also enlisted into the King's African Rifles during the World War II. in Lagos, Dr. David Awurawo. He's a senior lecturer from the History and Strategic Studies Department of the University of Lagos. And in Cairo, I have with me Ambassador Fatih El Shazli. He's a current advisor to Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation. He's also the director of the Executive Secretariat for the Demining and Development of the Northwest Coast. To you all, thank you very much for joining in this conversation. Joseph Inima with me here in Nairobi. Let me start off with you first, because you actually participated, you fought in the Second World War there. You are the highest ranking Kenyan that participated in the Second World War. First, can you give us an account of what you remember, your recollection of the war?
Well, during my time in the war, I joined in 1939-45. I was in a school at Kakamega, and then the principal ordered me to go and join the army, for the war got broke. When I joined the army, I was transferred to Nairobi, whereby I stayed there for about 6 months, and then went to Nanyuki for further training, and then went and fought the war in Mogadishu and Kismayu, Mandera, Berbera, Gonda, and Abyssinia.
I just want to get a little bit more understanding of how you felt fighting in that war, because it was not an African war. How did you feel, though, fighting in that war as an African for other countries?
We were just to help the Europeans because they were our immediate government. So they called us to go and help them. So we willingly went to help them to fight the Japanese.
All right, Ambassador Shazli, you're hearing Joseph Inima here in Nairobi, a war veteran, talking about how the Africans were asked to go and help in the fight in the Second World War for the British colonies there. I mean, we're now marking the 70 years anniversary of the end of the World War II. Do you feel, though, that Africa's contribution has been recognized today?
Now, yes, but this is a new thing, that the combatants of the Second World War recognize the contribution of Africans and of African people. For instance, if I talk about Egypt, usually on the 24th of October each year, this year we are going to have the 73rd anniversary of the Alamein battle, which Winston Churchill described once, that he said, we have not won a battle before Al-Alamein, and after the Alamein we have not lost a battle. So the Al-Alamein was a turning point, and the German troops, under the leadership of Rommel, they wanted to take Egypt in order to seize the oil fields in the Middle East and control the traffic between the between the United Kingdom and their Asian and Eastern African properties. So that's why Al-Alamein battle is considered the turning point in the course of the Second World War. Usually, I attended several times of this annual celebration on the 24th of October each year.
All right.
And I visited repeatedly the cemetery, International Cemetery, the Allied cemetery, and discovered how they have buried there thousands of African troops. And this annual ceremony is usually attended by the ambassadors and representatives of the African embassies accredited to Egypt.
I'm going to jump in there, though, Ambassador Shazli. I'm going to jump in there and bring in Dr. Awarawa, because you're talking about the very fundamental issues, the fight, the battle for El Alamein, which was a turning point in that World War II between the Axis and the Allies. And also, David, you've been hearing Joseph talk about his contribution in the Burma campaign. 70 years on, though, in Africa here today, whose war are we looking at? Whose legacy are we looking at? Whose role are we looking at? Whose victory was it?
Well, basically it was a European war. It was a war that started in Europe and spread to other parts of the world. The main protagonists when the war started were Germany on the other one side and Italy, and Britain and France on the other. Of course, they had their supporters here and there, and of course Japan supporting the Axis forces, Germany and Italy in the Pacific, in Asia. So it was mainly a European war, but in some sense too, it was also African, because the comment just made shows that, of course, there were efforts by Germany to threaten the peace of Egypt, and much of the fighting in East Africa and the Horn was partly to support the Allies on the one hand, but also to liberate Ethiopia, which had been invaded by Italy since 1935. So basically a European war, but in some sense also an African war.
All right, Dr. Awarawa, what was the, clarify for me though here, what was the contribution of the West African troops here?
The West Africa was not a theater of war as such, but by virtue of being territories under British and French control, of course, the British Commonwealth had, a common force that drew from the entire British Commonwealth. That made a number of West African countries to be involved, Nigeria, Ghana, and several others. Indeed, towards the end of the campaigns in Burma, there was a division that was established in West Africa, the 82nd Division, that contributed thousands of men that helped to fight the last segment of the campaigns in Burma. So West Africa contributed tremendously to the war, both in East Africa and also in Burma, by virtue of their status at that time as being colonies of either Britain or France, countries that were major protagonists in World War II.
All right, Ambassador Shazli, though, Dr. Awarawa is talking about the contributions of the various troops, though, and Africa's contributions from the west to the east to the north there. In your estimation, though, he does say that this was very much a European war with some African influence in there. Does it seem, though, that Africa's role in that war is being recognized?
No, it has never been officially recognized. Lately, the combatants of the Second World War, they talk casually about the role of the African troops. Funnily enough, if you visit the El Alamein Military Museum, you would find the combatants, both parties, the Axis and the Allies, they describe that war under the following slogan: war that was conducted without hatred. And I have been inquiring all the time, how come that you kill millions of people, you erase cities from the face of the earth without hatred? But they have never recognized historically in a bulletproof way the African contribution to this. It happens on the annual celebration that the countries of the Commonwealth are represented by their ambassadors to Egypt. And that's it. That's it. That is the maximum, I would say, recognition on behalf of the combatants of the Second World War.
We are going to ask one of the combatants who's here with us. Joseph, do you feel that you have been adequately recognized for your role in the Second World War?
No, we have not been recognized, and we are seeking the government to assist us.
What would you like, though, Joseph? How would you like to be recognized?
We would like to the government to recognize us in many activities and also in finance.
All right. Dr. Awarawo, we are looking at 1.35 million Africans who fought in the Second World War. How is Africa honoring these heroes? Is Africa actually honoring these heroes?
Unfortunately, not at all. Except for a cursory reference to their contribution when some celebrations are carried out. For instance, in Nigeria, on the 15th of January every year, we have the Armed Forces Remembrance Day, where those who have died in wars that Nigeria has been engaged in are remembered and honored. They just make cursory reference to those who fought in World War II. And of course, a couple of barracks in Nigeria are named, to reflect the participation in some of the wars, like Dodon Barracks, Mayon Barracks, Mogadishu Barracks in Abuja, a few of them like that. Beyond that, there has not been specific and concrete recognition of the hundreds of thousands, that took part in World War II, some of whom died, and even those who survived.
All right.
I think there's a consensus on that recognition has not been given to the contribution of Africa to the campaigns both in East Africa and in Burma in the course of World War II.
All right, Ambassador Shazley, I want to expand this conversation a little bit and look at the impact that war had on Africa, though. What was the impact of the war in Africa? Because many now talk about the Africans who fought in the war coming back with a different mindset, starting the liberation movement. What was the impact of that war on Africa?
You know, in the case of Egypt, for instance, we have the permanent legacy. We once said that World War II is still being fought on our soil, represented in the fact, the sad fact, that explosive remnants of the Second World War are still killing people and maiming people. We have 761 survivors of that war who are still suffering, and until very recently some explosions killed and wounded some of our nationals in Matruh governorates. So this is the legacy we have for the Second World War. Once I made a celebration of that, I asked people to go to, on the 24th of October, hoisting banners under this slogan, Stop World War in Egypt.
All right, but in terms of the liberation...
And at the same time, but I wanted also to add something.
Go ahead.
The area, the theater of the war, has a desert hinterland. We cannot reach to that desert hinterland, internationally known to be full of natural resources, oil, gas, and mineral resources. So this is a continuous impact we have. Deprive Egypt from a great potential for development in that part of the country.
All right, Dr. Awarawo, what's your take on this, though? I mean, because of when the Africans came back from that war, the fight for independence began in earnest. What's been the major impact, though, on the Second World War on Africa?
There was the immediate impact. People died, people were maimed, families were dislocated. And so in so many areas, Africa was affected negatively by its participation in the war. But the remote, I mean, the more wide-ranging, revolves around what the war stimulated. First, the Atlantic Charter that was signed in the course of the war, just when the war started, 1940, promises were made that, you know, it was a war for liberation, a war for freedom, a war for human rights, a war for democracy. And when the war came to an end, people held the colonial powers to that nobody will never again be governed except by a government with its consent. Of course, colonial governments were not governed by with the consent of the people. That, in addition to the influence of those who went to fight, who returned home, who galvanized others to take up the challenge against the colonial masters, all of these were issues that crystallized, that stimulated the independence movement from 1945 onwards. And, this began to yield fruit very quickly. India, 1947, Pakistan, 1947, and in the late 50s, and then from early 60s, we had this independent movement all over the place, such that tens of former colonies, became independent. So there was this other positive dimension, which was the stimulation of the independence movement in the immediate post-World War II period.
All right, Joseph, though, you were there at that period and all the way through to the liberation of Africa at independence. Do you feel, though, that the contribution of the combatants who came back from the Second World War, do you feel that in some way that fueled the liberation movement for independence?
At the time when the war ended, we were sent to Europe, to London, whilst King George VI was alive, and he gave us promises which were not done. He said that once when we go back home, he will give us, our children, a free education, give them land and jobs. This was not done. So we really asked the government to do something about to fulfill the promises.
All right, Dr. Awurawa, to you as well. Do you think Africa will be accorded its rightful recognition for what it contributed to the conclusion of the Second World War?
Well, 70 years have passed now, and not so much has happened. So if one looks at history, one would say maybe it will never happen. But we can only be optimistic that better late than never. Talking with specific reference to the British Commonwealth, one expects a whole lot to be done, more than what has been done. But we in Africa can start it. African governments, if the outsiders did not recognize them, African governments can be at the forefront. And if African governments are at the forefront, that may draw attention of those outside Africa, the Europeans, for whom Africans fought, to begin to pay greater attention to recognizing Africa's contribution to World War II. So we can always be optimistic that moving forward, we expect that the recognition that is required will take place, both from African governments to begin with, and also from the Europeans, for whom Africa and Africans fought from 1939 to 1945.
All right, gentlemen, we leave it there for now, but thank you very much for joining in the conversation in Nairobi. Mr. Joseph Inima, he's a retired war veteran. In Lagos, Dr. David Awurawa, he's a senior history lecturer from the University of Lagos. And in Cairo, Ambassador Fathi El Shazli, he's an advisor to Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation and also the director of the Executive Secretariat for the Demining and Development of the Northwest Coast. To you all, thank you very much for joining in this conversation. That's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. Remember, you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.